Chapter 2. Day blended into day without much to note from us. We prepared the thesis, and then you went to arrange for the voyage. I'd stayed behind to pack personal items that I might need, more or less impatiently doing unnecessary tasks to occupy time. I was caught in the fever of spaceflight, an intoxication unequaled. You arrived in a surprisingly short time, though it seemed interminable to me. "The ship's ready," you said. "Shall we go then?" I asked. You nodded, and I gathered up the few things I wanted. I was rather disappointed that I saw no one outside. I'd hoped to bid goodbye to my kindly neighbors, and perhaps brag a bit, but at this time of day they were usually engaged in their studies. I decided not to intrude on anyone, so you and I walked quickly to your air car. In the air, I watched the ground beneath and the sky above. This was goodbye to Arkna for a while, and I already sensed a touch of nostalgia, though it was nearly drowned in the excitement I felt. When the air car began to settle, I looked down and saw that we were directly over the spaceport. I watched with interest as you maneuvered the air car into a cradle. Then we stepped out, you closed the air car door, and the cradle rolled swiftly into a large building. Within, I could see many more air cars of varying size and design, some which had not seen their owners for many years. You pointed to an arched entrance. "You will want to go through there." I glanced again at the thesis and other assorted records under my arm, smiled at you, and went through the entrance. I entered a large room in which people were engaged in a multitude of operations. A man handed me a metal recording strip, which I accepted. He then kindly led me to a small booth and said, "You can make your recordings here. Can I help you with anything?" In view of your former flight, I decided it would be best not to have an observer. I could record the information necessary without help anyway. "This'll only take a moment," I said to my guide. "I won't need any help." He smiled and walked away. I fed the recording strip into the machine, made pertinent notes on my thesis, and read off other data from the bewildering array that I possessed. When I'd finished, I stopped the recording machine and was rather surprised to have the recording strip come out of a slot. Suddenly, I realized that this was my copy, though what I needed it for, I couldn't imagine. I took the strip into my folio with the other things and left the booth. My guide stood waiting for me. "I wish you a pleasant voyage," he said. "If you will step through that door there, you will be directly on the field." I thanked him and once again surveyed the busy room. Great banks of automatic calculators hummed industriously, filing thousands of bits of data. By now, my own comments were whirling through these complex machines, but where, no man could say. Presently, I realized that I was wasting time and hurriedly went out the entrance. You were waiting for me outside. "Did you get caught in one of the calculating machines?" No," I replied. "I was merely watching the process. I'm sorry." "Perhaps I should have processed for you, but I thought you would enjoy the experience." "Just what does it all accomplish?" I asked. "It leaves a permanent record on file of the trip so that data can be plotted, and in cases of exploratory expeditions, it prevents duplicate trips from being made." "Huh, very interesting," I murmured. "Well, everyone's aboard ship. Ready to go?" I nodded, and we stepped into a small ground car which sped outward toward a gleaming spaceship. "Tell me," I said thoughtfully, "how does it come that a philosopher should file those records?" "Oh, those are only the speculations on the trip and its objectives," you explained. "The director of the flight goes through the other end of the building, plots out the approximate course and all that." "You got through in a surprisingly short time," I said. You smiled. "Oh, well, it's only the big ships that bother. A small explorer like ours is not worth clearing. Besides, they have all the information necessary from your report." The ground car slowed and stopped beside this ship, seemingly poised to spring into the air. I studied it with avid eyes. "You know," I murmured, "we have a tremendous job ahead of us." For the first time, the gravity of the situation had touched me. We were about to leave home for a planet which was a horror, and our speculation that this planet could suddenly burst into a dreadful menace to all life, a grasping, bloody empire, was a dampening thought. "Oh well," you sighed. "We'll meet that when we come to it." We both realized we felt a responsibility to the Union, to our fellow creatures. However, we didn't have to go on this trip. Perhaps it might be wiser to let other and more experienced minds do this. Were we being foolhardy, I wondered? You seemed to wonder the same thing as you touched a button on the little ground car and watched it scoot backward to the place it had come from. You took one last look around, then started toward the ship. I realized that the light was quickly waning, so I followed in your footsteps, each step seeming to add weight to my feeling of responsibility. The instant the port closed behind us, that now familiar excitement, that thrill of going to space, returned. This is what I've been waiting for all these years, and I was determined to enjoy it to the utmost. I immediately retired to my quarters and began restudying the material in my folio. I felt it might be possible to reach a tentative conclusion with what information I had. At least, I would try. I saw nothing of you until we were in space. As I was finishing my evening meal, you entered the small room and sat down beside me. You looked strangely exhilarated, your eyes revealing an intenseness I had never quite known before. I had to admit that I too was feeling the intoxication of space, and I wondered if it was apparent. You noticed the folio at my elbow. "Have you found anything yet?" "Nothing new," I replied. "I've gone over some of the material to see if I couldn't reach some sort of conclusion. It would help in our exploring, you know." "Now that you mention it, I wonder what you do plan to do." I smiled wryly. "Well, the obvious thing would be to destroy the planet." I paused a moment to allow you to look properly shocked. "Of course, that's at variance with the code, and there's no point in destroying the code to save us from its potential destroyers." "Bach," you said with sudden seriousness, "I do not see why we couldn't explain the code to them, and in time they would accept it. It's been done on other planets." "Jovian, in all my studies and in all my researching during the past few days, I've not come across any planet which compares in any way with this one." I dropped the folio back on the table. "In fact, as far as I know, a form of the code may already exist on the planet, considering all the other impossibilities present." "I never thought of that," you replied. You thought about it for a moment, then shook your head. "No, I don't believe they've ever heard of the code. They would not be as they are if they had." "We will see," I said. "Either way, it makes little difference. If they have heard of the code, it obviously means nothing to them. If they haven't, I'm quite sure that they could not understand it, except in certain instances, of course." "But why not?" you asked. "Surely if someone—" "Do you understand it?" I interrupted. "Why, I guess so," you replied. "That is, I understand, well, I observe the code, of course, but, well, I've never gone into the problem." I smiled. "That's not unusual. You're a technician and would have no reason for giving it a second thought." "That is strange," you said. "Here, I've observed the code all my life, and I've never stopped to question it in any way. I realize that I'm no philosopher, but I am curious as to how it works." I laughed. "Very well, then. I'll make a bargain with you. You show me around the ship, and I will explain the fundamentals of the code and why it works." "Agreed." We rose and left the dining chamber, stopping into a corridor. The actual foundation of the code, historically speaking, I began, can be traced to the star gods, or what is also known as the Elohim, the very forces of creation. It's been proven over time, through the mass effort of an untold number of people. Long ago, early scientists were experimenting on perception, aside from physical means. You mean like rapport? Precisely. These scientists discovered that wheels and games of chance— What? A game of chance was one wherein the player competed against random choice. For example, take a bit of plastic cording, stretch it between your hands until it breaks. Then you and another, having already made opinions as to where it would break, determine who came closest. Sounds rather stupid to me, you said. Nonetheless, such games existed, I continued. There were wheels which stopped at random positions, electronic circuits that lighted a lamp at random, and all of these games were computed on the basis of random probability. Bach, I confess I don't see what this has to do with the code. I'm coming to that, I said. You see, these scientists discovered that some people were able to determine what would occur in a random action, and still others were able to affect these random choices measurably. Of course, you agreed. If I were to break a piece of cording, I would know where it would break. Or if I wanted to break it at some particular point, I would only have to apply the necessary mental stress. Yes, but you see, I explained, our ancestors were just discovering that we had these capabilities. Games of chance disappeared within a short time afterwards. However, philosophers had a new problem to deal with. They had to discover whether or not there was such a thing as random selection. But of course there is, you said. I smiled. Only in a certain sense. Suppose I have a disc of metal with a mark on one side and I toss this disc into the air. Which side will come down most often, providing I exercise no control? Neither side. Now, suppose I had exercised no control, and I kept flipping this disc, and it so happened that the marked side fell uppermost 100 times consecutively. Which side would be most likely to turn up on the 101st toss? You pondered this for a moment. Actually, Bach, the 100 previous throws have no relationship to the 101st, so I would say that probability was equal for both sides. I nodded. This would mean that the disc could be flipped without control a tremendous number of times, coming up one side and the other, and from that 101st toss onward, the scoring would be approximately equal for either side. Yes, I think so, you replied. That would also mean that this hypothetical disc would always have approximately 100 more scorings for one side than for the other, if you include the first 100 tosses. Well, no, you said. I imagine that it would eventually become even. So would I replied. And I might add, so it would. You see, every action has an effect upon the actor as well as upon subsequent actions. An action could be unrelated to any other action only in an infinite universe, which is, of course, absurd. Do you mean then that there is no random choice? I could go on and prove it, I replied. However, it would be tedious. I merely quoted this example to make the philosophical aspect clearer. You scratched your chin. But how does this relate to the code? The basic premises of the code apply to the greater part of our actions directly and to all of them indirectly. Since every action has at least one alternative, and usually many more, we're able to select actions which adhere to the code, a process which becomes automatic in time. You see, the results of our actions accrue to us just as surely as those 100 additional flips of the disk accrue to the disk's future. The code was said to come down from the Elohim itself. It's been studied over the course of many lifetimes and with much effort, so that your actions will have the least possible future complications. In other words, your actions under the code will affect you less in the future than actions outside the code. You muttered. Would it not be better to alter the code so that the desirable things are likely to happen to us? Desirable things, I replied, smiling, are those which have the fewest bonds with either the past or the future. You love freedom, Jovian, and to you it is most desirable. Can you imagine freedom which is bound? And would such a thing be freedom at all? No, my friend, the code can only be modified so that we have fewer and fewer obligations to either the past or the future. Obligations are the source of unpleasantness and difficulty. In fact, philosophically speaking, obligation to the code itself is the final bond to be broken by our descendants. And so, the code will be perfect when it no longer exists. You frowned. I cannot help thinking, Bach, you said thoughtfully, that there is some fundamental flaw to this idea. Just about everyone does, at first, I replied. But after a little study, you come to the realization that the code is based on valid assumptions. And it works, which is important. But enough of this. We've been standing here for some time. Is this the control room door? You nodded and pressed the switch, which opened the panel. There were several people in the small room. 2 were at panels covered with complex instruments. The pilot was looking into a large viewplate in the forward end. 2 more were seated at the controls of a flight integrating machine. No one paid any attention to us as we entered. You guided me toward the pair at the integrator, one a rather plump woman, slightly older than either of us, and the other a very thin man who had startlingly white hair. The man looked up as we approached. Bach, you said, this is Aeon and, turning to the woman, Kimmy. They're absolutely the best flight integrators there are. You turned. And this is Bach, who is to direct negotiations and operations on the planet. I nodded to both of them, a pleasant couple, and I found myself wondering if they were companions. They certainly seemed to work well together. Kimmy looked up suddenly and smiled. Yes, she said softly, we are companions. I was momentarily embarrassed as I realized that my thoughts had intruded, but I smiled. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't mean to disturb you. Oh, you didn't disturb me, she replied quickly. Aeon and I have been together a long time now, and we find that our perceptions are far more sensitive than they used to be. Our Brind equivalents were high to begin with. Is that so? I murmured, interested. I noticed that her hands operated the complex integrator board without pause. I imagine Brind would have been happy to have you live in his lifetime. Aeon looked up from the integrator, and at that instant, Kimmy's fingers stopped moving. What is this? You asked. Are you aware of nothing outside your technology? I asked. Brind was a philosopher who developed a system of equivalence. It was his contention that life companionship raised the perceptive level of the individual to the equivalent of the team. This, in turn, increased the abilities of companions working together. This, in turn, sharpened the perception of the individuals. It works something like those old electronic circuits where the feeble impulse is amplified and part of the amplified impulse is fed back into the circuit. I forget the name of it now. Regeneration, you said. But do you mean that 2 minds working as a unit act as a regenerative circuit? If they can work together naturally, I replied. Brind contended that certain individuals were paired mentally with others of the opposite sex. He worked out a numerical system, giving the high and low values for the several perceptive levels, then showed that the ideal mate for his example had inversely proportional ratings. What Kimmy meant was that both she and Aeon had vast differences between each other, which were close to inversely proportional, meaning that they were high Brind equivalents, or more able to function as one mind instead of two. Consequently, their combined perception is several times keener than yours or mine. Perhaps there is more to companionship than I'd thought, you said. This from you of all people, I said, laughing. You've always said that companionship was the loss of freedom of the individual. It is, Aeon said. But I like it that way. Besides, Kimmy always wants what I want, so there's nothing lost, actually. You know, Kimmy said, I'm very interested in this planet we're going to. Could you tell us something about it? Frankly, I replied, I know less about it than Jovian. You snorted. Bach is absurdly modest. He's been explaining the intricacies of the planet and the problems involved for days. Then the plans for the survey are complete? Aeon asked. I shook my head. I've been telling Jovian the various things that would not work. About the only thing I'm sure of is that whatever we do, it must be done in utmost secrecy. It's the only way we'll be safe. If the people of this planet suspected the existence of a civilization such as ours, it would not spur them to develop themselves, but would only urge them onward toward greater technical development so that they could spoil and plunder. They don't rise to match the status of one more advanced. They tear down the advanced one to the level of themselves. Kimmy and Aeon looked at each other, unbelieving. However, I added, I think Jovian has a plan. As yet, I have none, yet Jovian seems far too self-assured to be depending on myself alone. Perhaps you could trade places, Kimmy suggested. Aeon and I were on an expedition to a rather small planet once, wherein the ship's director conceived of a way of dealing with the inhabitants after the philosopher was afflicted by some strange disease. Oh, yes, I remember, Aeon replied. To complete the confusion, the ship's director was injured in a fall, not badly, and the philosopher directed the flight home, as he had recovered by then. That's an excellent idea, I said, laughing. Jovian, you can give me your flight coordinates and data, and here's the folio of the planet. Agreed, you said in mock seriousness. You took the folio, and suddenly I realized that the others in the control room were watching us. They obviously were waiting to see if we were jesting or in earnest. I felt rather pleased that our jest was not transparent. At that moment, the recording strip that I had tucked in my folio fell to the floor. You picked it up. Aha! You exclaimed. Keeping secrets? What do you mean? I asked. You were supposed to drop this in the slot by the door. Oh, I murmured. I hope. Can the damage be repaired? I didn't know. You laughed. It's all right. There's no chance that there will be any duplication of our journey. You grinned at my embarrassment. It looks as though you cannot even handle the philosophic end of this trip. I do hope you can direct the flight better than this, you said, waving the recording strip. I felt my face turning red. On second thought, you said, we will not be in flight when negotiations are begun, and they will be complete before we leave the planet, I trust. So perhaps I can handle the survey and direct the flight too. That way, you'll be free to scrape the repulsor grids and polish the handrails. I tried very hard not to laugh. Oh, no, I protested. I couldn't think of overburdening you. I'll handle the flight and the negotiations so that you'll be free to scrape magnetic matter from the hull. The pilot smiled and turned back to the view screen. The other two, who had been at the control panels, joined us. Bach, this is Nard, the engineer, you said, indicating a muscular man whose skin bore a touch of blue. This would indicate Vestilian ancestry, I decided. It's good to know you, the engineer said. Your acquaintance is an honor, I replied. And this is Luna. She was a small and very charming girl with the appearance of extreme competence. Luna is the communications operator. The best, naturally. I only have the best with me. An honor, I said. Indeed it is, she replied. The learned Bach. I looked at her sharply. Do you mean you've heard of me? Her eyes twinkled. I've been on many expeditions with Jovian, and for some reason our conversations always center around you and your work. I think that outside of technologies, Jovian finds you most interesting. Huh, I said, turning to you. So you have been talking about me. Well, of course, you replied, guiding me over to the pilot. I find all philosophers interesting. That's the first sign, I sighed. Of what? You asked. I shook my head sadly. It will not be long now. Soon, you'll decide to become a philosopher. It is too bad. You're such a good technician. You laughed. The day I become a philosopher will be the day you become a technician. You turned to the pilot. This is Bach, the philosopher. He's going to polish the rails for us. The pilot laughed, his eyes still fixed on the view screens. This is Michael, you said to me. Michael glanced over his shoulder and nodded, then turned back to his vigil. I hope you'll forgive me for my ineptitude, I said. This is my first flight. Oh, don't feel badly about the strip, Michael replied. Jovian failed to leave the flight directions with me and disappeared after the takeoff. When the time came to call the ship into the field, and still I had no information, I let it go. Actually, we're all negligent. You laughed. Don't worry, Bach. You didn't know any better. I wish I could say the same for you, I murmured. If this is your first flight, Nard, the engineer said, then perhaps you would like to watch the viewplate. Michael is preparing our course for metaspace flight. Yes, I replied. I would find it very interesting, if someone will explain it to me. Well, Nard began, we don't understand metaspace, but we do know that this space is not relative to our own. We can create a temporary point of relativity, the warp, and the ship passes through this. Metaspace is thought by some to be a space having a lower probability curve, or perhaps higher, depending on your school of thought. It's my belief that it's a space into which we could have been born. We also know that it's a multiply tangent, and that certain places are more easily entered than others. One of the easiest points of entrance is just ahead, fortunately, not far from Arkna. Yes, I've heard the theories, I said. But why is it so easy to travel in this other space? Easy? Nard asked. What I mean is that with so little of this metaspace understood and so little data, how can the flight be accomplished? Purely empirical, Nard replied. We're able to enter and emerge at approximately that desired location. We do know that it concerns linear distance, as there's only a fraction of the linear distance in our own space. For that matter, there's nothing in metaspace that is exactly equivalent to normal space. The only danger that really exists, aside from collision, is in energy levels. A ship in this space must remain in free flight without power. Even so, it must reestablish quanta gains or losses after changing from one to the other. If the gain or loss is too great, the ship would be imprisoned in metaspace until an approximate compensation was made. Unfortunately, there's no relative standard to go by, so a ship in metaspace, trapped there by excessive quanta levels, must experiment, sometimes for months, before they can release themselves. I like this idea less and less, I murmured. I realized that knowing about metaspace and entering it were two different things. You and Nard laughed, guiding me forward. We looked over Michael's shoulders at the viewplate, a large, rectangular affair with a small circle in the center. On this background, the stars before us showed bright and clear. Michael placed a finger in the center of the small circle. "This star," he said, "is our target." He flicked a couple of keys, and a tiny bluish cross appeared in the center of the circle. "In just a moment, I'll adjust our course so that this star will be centered under the cross. In ordinary flight, the course we'll follow would lead us many parsecs astray. However, if Aeon and Kimi have integrated properly, and they always do, we will arrive within the orbit of the planet we want." We watched tensely, or at least I was tense, observing Michael making minute adjustments. At last, he began to turn two of the large knobs on the board before him. Slowly, the star he had pointed out moved towards the cross. Nard turned and walked back to his control panel, and I noted that Luna had resumed her seat. You nodded to her, and she pushed a button, sounding an alarm. "You will not mind the flash," you murmured. "It's just a momentary sensation as we pass the warp area, but perhaps you'd better hold on to the handrail." I nodded and grasped the rail, noting that the star was nearly centered. Michael touched a button, and a high-toned signal sounded. "Ready?" you asked. I had meant to say that I was, but at that instant, a shock ran through my body. It was like the shock of dropping several feet, or of being struck by something. It lasted the merest fraction of a second, then was gone. The plate before Michael was completely blank. It was neither black or white, but a sort of neutral gray, and gave the impression that the viewer was disconnected. "The view screens are not operating," I said, a little worried. You laughed tolerantly. "The viewers pick up a charge when passing through the warp, and the grids have to discharge themselves," you said. "They will come on in a moment." "I see," I muttered, although I didn't see at all. I turned back to the viewers. They flickered several times, then sprang into brilliant life. And then, for the first time, I saw that other space. It was not like our own, for it teemed with giant suns and cosmic formations that seemed not to resemble star groups at all. "What lives in this space?" I asked. "I know of no contacts, and it seems odd since metaspace traveling is no longer a novelty." "We do not know what's here," you said. "The matter in this space is inimical to our own. Its atomic structure is different, and it reacts with our matter." "You mean it's inverted matter?" I asked. "Not exactly. It's a form of matter which doesn't have a counterpart. Some have theorized that it's not matter as we know it, but an entirely new atomic system, a static system." "That doesn't seem likely," I said. You smiled. "The only other theory is that the space here is relatively short, while the time is long, although it's a bit absurd to separate space-time into arbitrary parts. We maintain our own time rate because we've not become a part of this space. The warp field makes a kind of shell around us through which only light comes." You laughed. "Although what we see as light are really hard radiations. You see, the speed of radiation is slower here." "If that was true," I said, "then there should be a far greater inertia." "Oh, there is," Aeon said over my shoulder. "At least it would explain the loss of one of the early experimental ships. The last communication received from them stated that they were going to pass through a dust cloud. The search afterward revealed very little, but a sampler, which was brought in, contained a few fragments of hull alloy, so we assumed that the dust cloud was nearly immobile to the passing of the ship. Perhaps there's greater risk to this than I thought, I said. Are we likely to run into a dust cloud? No, Michael said. We shouldn't meet any bulk of matter at all, though our hull will be damaged somewhat by vagrant dust particles. This matter reacts with ours, and the result is energy. Otherwise, a stray dust particle would punch a hole through the ship like a K-beam. Well, this has certainly been an education, I murmured. For us too, Kimmy replied. We're mapping out this area as much as possible so that flights to follow will have a chartered course. How much longer will we continue in this space? I asked. Several more days, you said. Days? Oh, yes, you replied. Traveling as far as we are, we were able to enter the space at a very high rate of speed. For shorter trips, we have to proceed very slowly. I guess I was never cut out to be a spaceman, I muttered. Well, come and meet some who were, you said. You guided me on a tour of the rest of this ship, showing me the other things of interest, and best of all, the small swimming pool. It was part of the water regenerating system, but it served the purpose admirably. Water was stored here between the first and second purifications, and it was clean enough to swim in, which was the important fact to me. You had to leave me and go back to the control room, and you obviously had much work to do, for I saw you only at meals. I completed my work on the survey and spent my time stargazing in this alien space, enjoying the drama and swimming. I did have a companion, however, Armando, the physician. He, too, was a swimming enthusiast and an interesting conversationalist. Armando and myself were swimming one afternoon when you entered the small room. Come on out, you two fish, you called. We're almost ready to enter normal space. I shall have to go to my quarters, Armando said to me. After we enter normal space, I check the air, water, and such. I'll join you before we land. All right. I dried myself hurriedly and dressed. I went up the small companionway toward the control room in a run. Inside, everyone was furiously busy, so I stood by the handrail and waited. You stood beside Michael, watching the instruments, apparently satisfied. You glanced at me and smiled, and I took hold of the handrail again. Michael flicked several switches, and I noticed that the integrator was behind me, humming and clicking. Our return to normal space has to be automatic, you said. If we traveled a few minutes too many or too few in the space, it would take many days of flight in our own space to correct the error. I nodded, and you turned back to the instruments. Everyone seemed feverishly busy. Kimmy and Aeon actually worked as an integrated unit. Luna's eyes seemed glued to a clock-like dial, and Nard sat tensely waiting, occasionally checking the meters before him. I couldn't begin to understand the complex controls in this small room, and it discouraged me to be so unlearned. I resolved to learn more about all this at my earliest opportunity. Michael's voice startled me. Do the figures check out? We are some distance beyond a charted course, you answered. But everything seems to be all right. You turned to Luna. Are the detectors at full strength? They are on full, she answered. They will not detect dust unless it's pretty dense. I know, you replied. That's what worries me. Still, this is close enough to the course we followed, so it should be clear. Aeon pulled a thin piece of plastic from the integrator. Here's the final checkout. You took the bit of plastic and studied it. Then you walked to the communications panel and pressed several buttons. The high-pitched alarm signal rang through the ship, and I knew we were at the end of this part of our flight. You took a hold of the handrail beside me, and Luna moved alongside. I saw Michael's hand tensing to press a key as you said, Well, we've made it, so... A screaming crash and several rocking explosions cut off your words and threw me to the deck. The lights went out, and at just that instant, I felt the flash as we returned to our own space. I sat up dazed, listening to the scurrying feet, wondering what to do. You called to me in the darkness. "Buck, are you hurt?" "No, I think not," I replied. "What happened?" "We do not know yet," Nard said. "I'm cutting in the auxiliary power system now." No one seemed excited or upset, so I calmed myself and waited patiently. Presently, the lights glowed, then came on brightly. I got to my feet and looked at the view screen. It was blank. "Is the ship damaged?" I asked, anxiously. "We struck some matter in the other space," you replied. That's my guess." You were very pale and trembling slightly. I knew you felt the weight of your responsibility, and I couldn't think of anything to say, could think of nothing to do to help you. With the others, I stared at the blank face of the viewplate. It flickered, then came on, one corner remaining opaque. "Well, we're fortunate," Michael said. "At least we're not blinded." "We will try the power then," you said. You turned to Nard. "How much reserve have we?" "Very little," Nard replied, his voice tense and unnatural. "Can we land?" you asked. "I think so," Nard answered. You turned again to Michael. "All right, Michael, let us try." Michael pressed the acceleration keys gently. I felt the deck quiver slightly, but no more. He adjusted the acceleration control. The deck quivered again. Resignedly, he snapped the keys off. "Is it bad?" I asked. "I can pull harder than that with my hands," Michael replied. "What do the meters show?" you called to Nard. "The repulsor grids are all burned. Very little ionization." "Is there anything I can do?" I asked. "Nothing anyone can do," you answered. What?" You looked at me strangely, and then walked to the integrator. Aeon handed you another bit of plastic which you studied for a moment. Then you looked at the dials as if rechecking something. Finally, you turned and faced us. "We will crash on the planet. Our forward motion will cause us to enter the effective gravitational fields." "But surely we have time to make repairs," I said. Nard had already begun to unfasten space gear and was preparing to step into it. "There's not enough time, Nard," you said. "We'll touch the atmosphere of the planet before you can operate the space locks." Michael reached far to one side and moved some other controls. "You see," he said to me, "we're not facing the planet. It will be in the view screen in a moment." As you spoke, a huge crescent came into view, gradually covering more and more of the screen. "Do we not have some power?" I asked. "No," you answered. "Michael's turning the ship with the inertia rotors." I turned back to the screen. The crescent had disappeared, and there was only a blackness. But in that blackness, I felt a solidity. I saw Luna's hands begin to tremble, and I saw you put one hand over hers and squeeze, reassuringly. You smiled, and she compressed her lips for an instant, then smiled back. At that moment, that incredibly high-pitched, screaming wail began, thinly at first, but mounting rapidly into a deafening roar. You looked at me then and nodded that farewell nod. Then we turned back to watch Michael and his impassive face as he reached for the useless controls. His fingers made fine adjustments, then paused for an instant over the control keys. Suddenly, he depressed them their full depth. And then it came, that shuddering, wrenching shock. It was a blow from behind that doubled me over the handrail. The tearing deceleration lasted only momentarily, but in that instant, you went head first over the rail, and though my hands clutched for you, my reactions were much too slow. I thought I was losing consciousness, but then the stress was gone. I looked up at the viewplate and saw nothing but a dark blue horizon. I didn't know what it was, but Michael was fighting with his controls to keep that horizon before him. Occasionally, shudders and shocks rocked the ship as he somehow coaxed bits of life from the repulsor grids. Again, the lights went out and the view screen was blank. My dazed senses began to recover, and I groped on the deck for you. Again, the roar outside the ship began to mount, the roar of thick air. I thought I found you, but just as my fingers touched you, it seemed that my body was crushed flat. I remember an instant of excruciating agony as I slid on the floor and struck heavily against something. In a half-conscious state, I felt the ship pitching and rolling back and forth, seeming to rise and fall. I tried to understand, but couldn't make my mind function. At last, I gave up and lay there on the deck, unthinking, uncaring.